You are witnessing Hymn Society History, our first live digital sectional, because last year's digital conference did not include any live sectionals. They were all pre-recorded. And so this is the first of many live sectionals that we're having for this year's conference. So thank you for being here. This will be recorded and made available as an archived session. So once you've seen how awesome the session is, you can email all your friends and say, register for the Hymn Society conference and check out this recording of this sectional because it was great. The other thing is I will put the handout link in the chat, which I just did. So you should see that in the chat. If you want the handout, that's where it is. And feel free to use the chat as much as you like. Keep it nice, keep it professional, but feel free to engage as much as possible. We also have a Q&A function, so you can feel free to put questions in the Q&A. And then you can upvote those. So if someone asks a question and you think it's a great question, you can open up your Q&A function and you can actually click like a like button kind of thing, and it'll let us know that you really like that question and we should make sure to answer it. And the last thing is our presenters today are going to introduce themselves. So I'm very happy to introduce or to welcome Marcell Steuernagel. That was really close. I've been working on it for like 3 years now. And I'm German. I have German heritage. I should be able to get this. But they're going to introduce themselves. So Marcell, thanks for being here and take it away.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this first sectional, the guinea pig sectional. And let's see how this goes, right? As Brian said, this is the first time we're doing this, and we're very excited for this year's conference and very happy with the opportunity to kick things off with this sectional about radical hospitality in worship. And before we go any further, my name is Marcell Silva Steuernagel. I'm the Assistant Professor of Church Music and Director of the Master of Sacred Music program here at Southern Methodist University, Perkins School of Theology. And I proposed this sectional on my own, and there was a point where I just realized it was really stupid, and I think that's the right word, to conduct a sectional on radical hospitality by myself, because that's just more of the same one person kind of pontificating on the subject. It doesn't demonstrate what we're trying to do. And I originally invited two sacred music connected people here at SMU to turn this into a conversation. One of them is Allison Shutt. She's a recent graduate of the Master of Sacred Music program, and I'll let her introduce herself in just a minute. The other is Tommy Shepard, who's one of our first Doctor of Pastoral Music graduates here at Perkins. That program is directed by my good friend and colleague, Michael Hahn, who's here with us. And I want to let Allison introduce herself, but first I want to greet all of those who were here. Thank you for being here, both live and synchronous, and both those of you that are going to watch the sectional later. It's good to see all of you. I do wish it were in person so we're able to hang out in good hymn society fashion, but it's good to be here. Allison, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Well, first, thank you to you, Marcell, for inviting me to be a part of this discussion, and thank you to the Hymn Society for the opportunity and Brian to discuss such an important topic. So I am Allison Shutt, and as Marcell said, I just graduated from SMU with a Master of Sacred Music with a concentration in choral conducting. Prior to that, I served for 4 years in the music department at a local church in North Carolina, which is where I am now. And it's there that I discerned a call to ordained ministry and connected my passion for music with my passion for outreach. And as such, I am currently pursuing ordination as a deacon in the United Methodist Church, through which I hope to work as a bridge between the church and the community, especially as I enter into bivocational ministry as a middle school and high school band director in North Carolina.
Thank you, Allison. So here's what we want to do. We planned this with an initial round of considerations for each of us, and it was going to be me, Allison, and Tommy. Tommy's quotes are actually in the handout. So if you want to read through them, I'm going to reference his work more than once. And I would encourage you to read through them as well. He's doing some really good work, excellent research, excellent connection between the community and the church. And in both Allison's and Tommy's work, as they were writing papers and doing research towards their own degrees, we were having, it's almost like Groundhog Day, where you talk about, the same thing over and over. One, because it's really important, and two, because sometimes it does take us more than one round for a conversation to get to a place where we feel like there is a next step, right? And when I think of this issue of radical hospitality, I think that's what we're talking about here. So I'm gonna speak for a little bit. Allison's gonna speak for a little bit, and then the quicker we turn this into a conversation with all of you who are here, and we have some heavy hitters in the room. We have Michael Hahn, we have Robin Knowles Wallace, we have Michaela, Amanda, Martha, M. Leask. I don't know how to say that name, your name.
Margaret Leask.
Margaret Leask. It's so good to have you all, and feel free to jump in, because the more people that do that, then the more fun we're going to have, hopefully, right? So I want to walk us through a little bit of history. When we think about church music and liturgy, worship, wherever you're coming from into this conversation, there's this almost like recent history development of the theme of hospitality in our conversations about worship, right? So we have this, I wouldn't say first generation, but definitely a period in which there was an important shift that had to do with the World Council of Churches, with the ecumenical work that was being done across the world as denominations established relationships. And suddenly this issue of global song, especially after the Second Vatican Council, became bigger and bigger and bigger. And congregations, denominations, publishers, conferences, they started thinking, well, how does the music that we do, either at an international gathering or at our own church, represent the diversity and the rich nature of the Songs Church throughout the globe? So you started seeing, things like everyone's singing Siahamba. It makes its way through a conference into a hymnal. People like Michael Hahn and others were doing really good work in establishing the framework for these negotiations of what we now call global song, right? These made their way into hymnals, which I consider almost a consequence of that first flourishing, is then consolidated into the hymnody of the Western Church, which is kind of the perspective that we're thinking about for this sectional. Right? If we had a conversation about global song across the world, that would be, first of all, quite unmanageable, and second, very, very complex, right? So the underlying question for this sectional, which is supposed to be both scholarly and practical, is, okay, that's all well and good, but how does that connect to what we do on Sunday morning? And what can we do to enact, impersonate, embody that intention of hospitality into what we do, right? So you have the second moment in which suddenly these songs start making their way into denominational hymnals. Now, it's one thing to publish a collection, say a Global Praise, right, 1, 2, and 3, where that is the focus of the collection. Now, it's another when you suddenly open a denominational or denominationally curated hymnal, and some of these songs are in there, right? That was an important development. In the meantime, the world changed, right? Think of the way that media traveled back and forth as recently as the 80s or the early 90s, and the way that media travels back and forth now. The way I describe it to my students is that changes that were already in motion were suddenly catalyzed. A catalyst in a chemical reaction speeds up the reaction. And I mean, just in the past year, because of COVID, we have like a catalyst on top of a catalyst. The pandemic on top of the information revolution. And there's this idea that suddenly we're much more aware of our neighbors, both near and far. And that changes what hospitality looks like in the scholarship, in the theological education realm, and in practical considerations on the ground. So following these changes, you have a body of literature that starts to account for hospitality in conversations about church music and worship, right? So you have Michael Hahn's Gather Into One, which is an excellent book. If you haven't read it, you should. I'm going to draw a couple of things from this, which discusses the topic of praying and singing globally with these kind of like Zoom case studies into particular people and realities, and then back to the big picture, and then zooming into Africa, into Latin America, into Asia, into what people are doing in some of these places. You have Randall Bradley's From Memory to Imagination, in which he starts to imagine what hospitality and worship can look like on the ground, right? And what that literature demonstrates, in a sense, is a shift from this idea of hospitality as something we can do on the fringes or at the margins of what our local ministries do, to an important concern in how we shape our liturgies and enact them. So having done that very superficial historical survey, I believe we are at a crucial point today. And I'm very thankful for the work that the Hymn Society and other organizations have been doing in providing a platform for these discussions around hospitality, diversity, inclusion, and worship. For me, there's a sense of urgency in taking this narrative and moving it to whatever next stage is the next stage, right? And I say that as a non-American living in Texas, kind of liaisoning between different realities, and in a sense, I think that is an ambassadorship to which we are all called in different ways. And the framework that I want to provide, in a sense, I hope that the framework can help you to locate yourself along that spectrum and reflect upon your own practices and how you might move them in particular directions. Okay. The first thing I want to say is that good intentions are great, y'all, but they aren't really enough. That's why this sectional is called Radical Hospitality, not just hospitality. Because of that urgency, I think that there are certain fronts in which we need to take urgent action, and this is one of them, right? So a lot of times in church, for example, Gerardo Marti in Worship Across the Racial Divide, also a really good book if you haven't read it, talks about tokenism as a common consequence of these imaginations of diversity and hospitality, in which you'll do what he calls an ethnic hire, and you can always point to that and say, hey, no, we have diversity, when in fact you don't. You just hired someone that looks different, right? So moving beyond that into what, Allison, I want you to talk about this a little bit more when it comes to your term. But the difference between having someone visit for a few days and inviting someone to come live in your home, right? So if someone visits for a few days, you'll open up the guest bedroom. Everyone will make do for a little while. You'll have fun. You flexibilize the rules of the house, right? Things are going to be different, but they're going to be different for a few days. And then your guest will leave and you can go back to your routine. That's one thing. It's another thing to invite someone to live in your home and be open to the way that living will change the way your life unfolds, right? In fact, there's a really good story that I would encourage you to look up on Google, of this really rich, affluent white guy who invited a homeless Black couple to live with him in his home, in his $1 million home, right? This happened more than a year ago, and you can read the original pieces and look at the original interviews, and they did a second round after a year about these people talking about how that changed their lives, right? Radical hospitality is much more like that. I keep using this example in every webinar, a long obedience in the same direction, right? Eugene Peterson. It's a commitment. It's a covenant that you make to uncomfortableness. This is not something new. You know, Han, Bradley, Marty, all these other people talk about this idea of the uncomfortable, John Bell, as a necessary step if you are committed to that idea of radical hospitality, because it means changing fundamentally the way we worship. And just to kind of wrap up this first talk, I want to present two concepts that I think are really important and can help us understand where we are and where we want to go. One of them, again, is not new. We see it in scholarship all the time, but you're not going to see it in like a church deacons meeting, right? Which is the concept of musicking. And this is something that Christopher Small proposed in 1998. And what Small was talking about is moving from this idea of music as a passive artifact, right? Music as an object, a thing that is neutral, that we manipulate, that we use, that we do with what we want, into music as an active process. Music, in that sense, musicking. Music from an object becomes musicking as a verb. It is something we do. And it is something that, as we do, has personal, social, political considerations, implications, consequences. When we music, we change. And those with whom we music change. And the context in which we music changes. Right? So for me, there's a lot of freedom, especially if you're designing worship for your local congregation, in thinking of the songs that you're programming for a Sunday, not as artifacts that you plug into this, Word document that you send out, but as invitations to an active process that we engage in communally. That's a big difference, right? Why is that good news in terms of radical hospitality? Because it changes our perspective on what hospitality means from something that I will solve by manipulating objects in a worship setting, right? If you think of the parts of liturgy as Lego pieces that you put together, into radical hospitality in worship as a rehearsal of an intention, an active process that, thank God, you get to practice with your congregation week in and week out, right? Both in the micro cycle, the tight weekly cycle of church, and the macro cycle, right? And that maybe that's a good first tip. I'll get back to that when we give you a couple of practical examples. But this idea of the macro and micro cycle and rehearsing, musicking on a regular basis in the direction of becoming a hospitable community, whatever that means for your community. The second is theologization. And if you want a reference for that, I mean, there are a couple you can use. I'm just shamelessly going to promote my own book here, Church Music Through the Lens of Performance. I put it out. It came out in March of this year on Routledge's Congregational Music Studies series. And in that book, I talk about theologization. I draw from audiation, which is a term we use in music ed to describe the phenomenon of engaging with the music and thinking about the music as you engage with it. So you're feeling and you're thinking at the same time, like a good improviser who can react to what's happening in the room and understand where this is going, what the drummer's going to do, what's the key change, what audiation is, that kind of embodied knowledge. So theologization in that sense is me pushing that concept into theology as an active, embodied, processual performance of theology. An active, embodied, processual performance of theology. In our case, through music. I put that in the chat so you have those two concepts with a very short definition that I'm using, okay? What does that term acknowledge? It acknowledges that when we go to church, it's not a transmission. It's not like The Matrix. Remember, I know that's an old reference, and anyone who was born after 1990 won't necessarily have seen that movie. But in The Matrix, they plug this thing into Neo, Keanu Reeves, and suddenly he knows Kung Fu. He knows all these things, right? That's not what happens in church. And church is a dialogue. Brian, I'm here for the Matrix references. Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. It's a dialogue, and theology happens as we perform it. We engage with not only the liturgy, but the people, the context, the narrative. So again, it's moving from this idea of theology as a static, immobile, monolithic thing that we try to understand to theology as a dance that we participate in. And one part of this dance is what we do in worship in our local settings. And then finally, there are a couple of things that I want you to be mindful of as you, and if you follow that link that Brian put to the PDF, you'll have everything in an organized fashion. I'm just kind of going through here. I wanted to touch on a couple of helpful, I hope, tips in this regard. So if this is a process, both the theological and the musical process that we engage in, and we're looking at hospitality, at radical hospitality as a goal, and you may have noticed that I did not define hospitality. I'll circle back to that after Allison speaks. Then there are many aspects to the music making process that you need to consider. An example, maybe you come from a fixed notation SATB tradition. In other words, you've learned that church singing means singing with a certain vocality, maybe a bel canto informed, Western lyrical vocality in 4 parts according to the hymnal. And you don't improvise, because that'll ruin the voice leading of the SATB. I mean, someone went through all that work to put that together. And if you just start layering parts on top of that, you're gonna harsh our mellow, you're gonna ruin our vibe or whatever. Then when someone comes in that comes from a different cultural context in which improvisation is not only allowed but encouraged, you suddenly have to reconcile 2 different ways of musicking. You see what I'm saying? Then you have language considerations. You have considerations around the performance practices as they relate to the body. How much are you supposed to move, or can you move or not? How much do we glare at people when they move more than we're comfortable with, right? I remember, and I start my book with this anecdote, playing in churches in Texas for the first time after having grown up and become a church musician in Brazil, where we're very much encouraged to move. And then I remember playing at a church in Texas, Central Texas, for the first time, and having the other band members just sort of look at me like, what are you doing? I realized I was moving way too much. I felt a little bit straitjacketed, and had to figure out what that meant, what was going on, right? Some cultures are, and this is something Michael Hahn talks about in Gather Into One, some music cultures are linear. So they're discursive. We have 7 stanzas of the hymn, and we think about it as theological rhetoric, right? In other cultures, you repeat the same thing 30, 40, 50 times. And that's where the meaning happens. So how do you recognize things, right? I'm going to stop now and pass it on to Allison, and then come back and try to tie a couple of these threads together. Thank you. Allison?
Thank you. So recently, I looked at the use of music in multicultural worship models as just one form of extending radical hospitality, in order to draw conclusions that can be applied to other areas in which we can practice radically hospitable musicking. Especially since so much research has been done in that area, I thought that would be a good place to start. So our congregations need to be reflective of the communities in which they are situated. This means that we need to welcome all manner of strangers, who are ultimately any person who does not fall within the narrow confines of what society or the church deems as acceptable, and therefore are pushed to the margins and considered less than. Through the Imago Dei and a rich understanding of the body of Christ, we are called to enter into community with the holy other. It is understanding that I am no better or worse than you, and means putting my personal preferences and privileges aside in order to understand and learn from you. This means being willing to wade into the uncomfortable, and it means celebrating that which makes us different, not glossing over it. Ultimately, I came to draw the distinction between hospitality and radical hospitality in this work. There's a difference between extending hospitality, which I view as, you are welcome into my space. here's what I have done to make you feel welcome, versus extending radical hospitality, which I view as me asking you to share what you need to feel understood and seen and welcomed. And this requires us both to learn each other with mutual respect and value. It is through this active practice of gift giving and sharing that the unknown becomes known, that those on the periphery become central and integral, and that those who are deemed, quote, invaluable or expendable to society become precious and vital members of the community. But this requires both the host and the guest to participate in this space, and it requires listening. It requires the dominant culture to actively seek out and make room for others. And this space should not be viewed as a loss of power or tradition, but rather a positive addition to the community. In addition, both through this research as well as practical experience, I have found that radical hospitality at its core is about relationships. I believe music, with its multifaceted nature, provides us with a unique tool through which we can practice radical hospitality. Music, used as an agent of radical hospitality, simultaneously works as a means of pronouncement and invitation, a means of building personal and communal identity, a source of advocacy, a creator of space, and a relational act. But in order to do this, we must first go out and listen to the needs of our communities. I really love practical and real world examples, so let me give a real life example. So prior to entering into the master's program at Perkins, I served in a music department of a church in North Carolina. While there, I led a handful of different groups, and one of those was a daytime handbell choir. I was elated when the members of this particular bell choir expressed a strong interest in engaging in musical outreach. Little did I know at the time that what they perceived to be musical outreach and what I understood musical outreach to be were very different things. I was looking at musical outreach as an extension of an invitation into relationship. So these reoccurring kind of interactions with people, not just these one-off kind of concerts or activities that we would do. So as such, I called up a local facility that serves adults with traumatic brain injury to see if they already had any musical offerings. And if not, would they be interested in partnering with this bell choir to create a joint chime choir? The facility said yes to the offer and asked for the practice to occur at the church so that they could venture out of their facility. I was so excited to tell the members of the church bell choir about this incredible opportunity to be able to open our doors and create lasting relationships with people who are typically barred from participating in church. We would be using music to pronounce that all are welcome in this space, that all are vital and important members of the body of Christ. We would be expanding our community and learning from people who are different than ourselves, and as such, enhancing our personal identities and creating a new communal identity together. We would be advocating for people who are typically looked down upon or ignored or scoffed at. And we would be co-creating a space through music where different people can come together and discover that maybe they are not so different. We would be creating real and lasting relationships with people who were different than us. The Bell Group was, shall we say, less than thrilled at this offer. They were actually very angry. Many threatened to quit. They couldn't believe I was taking away their practice time to do such a thing. I heard comments that this was my time and my church and my group. The Bell members saw this act of radical hospitality as a deep loss, instead of a beautiful way to add to our church community. And they were scared, and I can't blame them. I realized that my level of comfortableness with people with disabilities was not their experience. They questioned how we were supposed to interact with these people and said that they do not have the training to do this. And I was taken aback, but I was also resolved to move forward with the partnership. With much weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth on the side of the church bell group, we moved forward, and I watched as hearts began to soften and real relationships formed. While the group's primary goal was to make music well with the right notes and rhythms and expressive qualities, that was secondary in my mind. My primary goal was facilitating a space where barriers could be broken down and understanding could take place. After regularly inhabiting the same space every other week and working towards the same goal of preparing music, stories began to be shared, jokes were told, and the details of people's lives were offered up. Thank you for letting me play these. I've always seen them in my church, but I've never been allowed to join, said one member. Another member was a Methodist pastor before the accident that caused the traumatic brain injury, and so being physically present in the building that was a United Methodist church was meaningful. By the end of the first year, the church bell members became attached to the other participants, sharing and keeping updated on each other's lives. They would be sad and concerned when members were missing rehearsals. And at the end of each year, we gave a concert that was open to the entire church and hosted a lunch so that we could share a meal together, both bringing attention to the work of the area organization and being able to share in community with one another. We had plans to do a similar concert that would incorporate the families of the members of the facility as well as the other facility-bound members of the organization, but unfortunately that did not come to fruition in my 2 years leading the program. I had also hoped to ask the group to play in worship. I wanted to include this group because not only were they a part of our community, but I also believe that worship should be viewed as an extension of our lives and is therefore reflective of the work we are engaging in outside of that 1 or 2 hours a week. As such, in order to engage in radically hospitable musicking, our music ministries must engage in radically hospitable practices that are reflective of our communities. To do this work, we must go outside the walls of the church and engage with our community. It is this unique intersection of community organization and church music that I feel called to and hope to continue in the coming years. As I previously mentioned, I'll be serving as a middle school and high school band director at a local North Carolina school, and their emphasis of outreach and service in conjunction with my bivocational ministry through the United Methodist Church is where I hope to connect the work that I'm doing in the school with the work in the church and vice versa.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and some of your experience and vision moving forward. Now would be the time when Tommy Shepard would share his work. Tommy is, I mentioned, is one of our recent Doctor of Pastoral Music graduates here at SMU Perkins, and he is the worship pastor at Hendricks Avenue Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. And his work, his doctoral work, focused on the collaboration that he established with Don't Miss a Beat, which is a local nonprofit that works with underprivileged neighborhood children. And the journey he describes is a journey that resonates strongly with what Allison has been sharing. And I think that's an important point that we have to make when we're talking about radical hospitality. The first example that I gave was the difference between, receiving someone in your home for a few days versus inviting someone to live with you. The fact is that inviting someone to live with you might mean going places that you wouldn't otherwise go, right? So in that sense, the very fact that you're able to move from this paradigm of we want to be very opening and inclusive and welcoming, but still assumes that people are supposed to come where we are, is problematic, right? It's an important component of this idea of radical hospitality, but the other half of that coin is saying, I am willing to leave where I am, where I feel comfortable, and going to, right? Going to these environments that you wouldn't otherwise go to, going to environments in which musicking looks completely different from what you're accustomed to. And that means taking away from what you consider to be your time, your church, your program, anything in that direction. There's one thing that Tommy wrote and I wanted to share with you that might help to deepen that particular point. This is from his work, from his thesis. he says, early on, I wanted to be hospitable and eager to show my desire to partner with DMEV. Don't miss a beat. I proposed collaborative musicking events to Ulysses, who is his partner, that unintentionally placed burden on the DMAB staff and parents. He invited them to a bunch of programs. Come sing with us. We're going to do this thing at a museum. And Tommy says, blind to my own privilege, I did not consider parents' multiple jobs or late work schedules. The extra performances created more travel costs for the nonprofit across town. My attempts at hospitality were in fact power plays from my majority position. So what Tommy is recognizing, what he's acknowledging, is that if we don't think about the way power is distributed among the parties involved when we're thinking about hospitality, we aren't in fact being hospitable. We're placing an extra burden, right? A similar example happens with conferences, church conferences in the US all the time, where they'll say, you know, we want you to come. We'll pay for your accommodations. We'll waive your registration. Well, a plane ticket from the global south will usually cost, you know, several months of wages, and it still doesn't make it. Or they'll say we'll pay for the airfare, but to get a visa, that's debatable, both financially and both in terms of who can actually get a visa in many of these countries, right? So what about if you do your conference somewhere else? And I know that sounds like a daunting proposition because now suddenly everything changes, right? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about. That's exactly what we're talking about. That commitment to something that will necessarily make you uncomfortable, but it will definitely change the worshiping life of the congregation. And these things kind of come hand in hand. Yes, they're complex. Yes, they're complicated. Yes, they're convoluted. Yes, we don't want to do them, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't. Those are two different things. So this idea of inviting and going. Allison, I have a question that I wanted to ask you. You know, you mentioned that distinction between hospitality and radical hospitality. How did your perspective as a church musician, right, as someone who came into a program in order to develop your knowledge and skills to another level in terms of working with the church, how did that, in fact, as you thought about these things, prepare you to do what you're looking forward to doing right now? Because it might seem to some like a contradiction, right? I trained for this thing and I'm doing this thing, but you're not talking about it that way. You're talking about it in a very hopeful, life-giving way. And I wanted you to share a little more about that.
Yeah. Yeah. My kind of vocation now looks like a both and instead of kind of an either or. I fully expected coming out of the program to enter into a church and to get a minister of music job and to be kind of participating in this outreach, but from that perspective. But that became kind of evident that God wanted me to be in the community, which I'm very excited about because I think that I will be able to, my hope is to create relationships with area organizations and kind of get into these conversations about what does the community need, and then bring that to kind of the church side and say, here are our strengths and weaknesses and how can we come together to maybe help fill these needs. And so whether that looks like my band program, even as simply as like offering these concerts out in a public space that's in the community and making this a big community-wide festival. And then on the church side, having like lessons for underprivileged kids be housed within the church building and being able to kind of make these connections. And what I'm hoping to do in this year is to make kind of some introductions and build relationships with people so that that way I can make those connections in the following year. But I think that the training that I've received both as a deacon preparing for ordination and also in the MSM program has really allowed me to kind of take both sides and connect them together so that that way it's one flowing into the other, and expanding kind of my view of what worship can look like, and whether that's holding, just like the band concerts being held outside in a community center, holding monthly worship services outside or at a brewery, but finding these places where people are gathering and being able to kind of navigate those spaces more easily through both the ordination piece, but then also just being a member of the community through being a band director.
Thanks, Allison. I think I want to latch on to something you said, and to those who are with us, start thinking about those questions. If you want to post them in the Q&A, you can. If you want to post them in the chat, I think you can as well, Brian. I'm not sure, but
Yep.
okay, yeah. So then we can start broadening this conversation. It might seem like we're saying, if you do this thing, then you can't do what you've been doing for X number of years, right? I would encourage us to think of expansion and enrichment, and a couple of the terms that Allison used. In fact, what you're doing is kind of deepening your engagement with the possibilities of what it means to music as a community. And notice that when I say that, I don't necessarily only mean a church community, because we're talking about integrations, right? It's a way, you think about it as food, right? You've eaten, X, Y, and Z for your whole life. Well, now might be the time to learn how to eat, A, B, and C along with X, Y, and Z. But that means changing your palate, and it's uncomfortable. Something might be an acquired taste, right? But it's only if you're engaging to commit to the process, if you're committing to the process, that these things are possible. A couple of years, I think in 2019, we put on a hymn festival at the Hymn Society. It was John Thornburg, Marissa Glinius Moore, Jocelyn Henderson, Joe Stobaugh. I was involved, a couple of other people in Dallas, talking about this idea of appropriation and borrowing, and how complicated these things can become. And it might be tempting to say, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to sing a black gospel tune in my church. I'm not going to sing something from, Central Brazil. Because I am not allowed to. Well, there's, there are ways of doing things with integrity that would allow us to engage with these things in ways that honor and invite others into conversation, and that change us, right? And that's what we're going for, hopefully. Another example is the Center for Congregational Song is putting on a series of conversations about copyright, and it's so complicated. In fact, there's an article of mine coming out in the next edition of the Hymn on the same subject. And yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's difficult. Again, that does not mean we should not be engaging in this conversation, right? And that might mean that from the worship director or church musician's perspective, you're really going to have to factor in 2 or 3 times as much worship planning into your week, and drop something else to be able to do that, right? So I think there are major components in terms of leadership, strategy, visioning that need to be talked about when we consider these engagements with radical hospitality. And I'm going to get to this first question here. Michael is asking, you both refer to the issue of fear and discomfort as a block to engaging in and with the other, and consequently the other. Can you clarify a pedagogy for engaging those who are especially phobic about discomfort and fear of the other? What are the best initial steps you might take so they all won't quit and you won't be fired? Only partially joking. Very true. So I'm going to go back to the concept of musicking and try to give an example. Okay, so let's take Karen Lafferty's Seek Ye First. I believe 1964, right? So on a square beat, and nothing wrong with a square beat, sometimes that's all we need. Brian, I'm not even gonna Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And I can slow that down to make it more of a ballad, as Lafferty herself does in several YouTube videos, right? That slow, like rock pop ballad from the 60s, kind of Jesus movement feel to it. But what if I start tampering with that? What if I start making changes? And some of these I might announce, some of these I might just do, right? So an example from my church back in Brazil, first, the translation itself already modifies the musicking process and the musical artifact itself. Second, we realized very quickly, and this is South Brazil, okay? South Brazil is like the frozen, the rigid portion of the country where people, it's said that people in South Brazil move less than in other parts of the country. It's still scandalous for Southern Baptists in Waco, Texas, but whatever. So we realized quickly that when we did Seek Ye First in this kind of, very stable kind of way, people did engage, but when we did one subtle shift to the rhythm. First, we subdivided. So we subdivided in 2 and then in 4. Seek ye first the kingdom. So I'm syncopating the second downbeat. Dun, dun. That is Brazilian. It refers to a bunch of different Brazilian rhythms. When we turned that switch on, the congregation turned on. We didn't have to say anything, right? In subsequent years in clinics and seminars, I spoke about that and about the way that people engage with the song to my own congregation so that they could learn. And this was a Lutheran, very kind of German Philiac congregation, right? But they realized what it meant to bring in, Afro-Brazilian rhythm into worship and how that impacted the way they worship. So I think some of the changes are changes that you have to talk about first. And some are changes that you have to ask permission for. Sometimes it's better to apologize and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we already did that." And I think sometimes if you mess with the music, the musicking, there are ways of bringing in these components and making them part of our diet, right? And that applies for performance practices. Improvisation is, and Allison, I'll let you jump here in a second, but improvisation is another thing that I try to encourage. How do I move from a way of leading worship? Okay, so for example, I lead a lot of contemporary worship. Now, I might do it in a way that we're all just singing the music and then transitioning into the next song, right? But it's different if I become more of an enlivener. And my main role is not to sing the melody or the lyrics. My main role is to gloss, comment, improvise, connect, and transition. So I am treating a very Western, like CCM product in a very non-Western way, or at least in a more Pentecostal way, which might also be a good thing, depending on what you're doing, where you are, is taking practices from one tradition and bringing them into the other. Preparing for that is a process, because you have to learn how to do it to be able to teach others how to do it, right? So that again might mean engaging with practices that you're not comfortable with, but making them natural and non-threatening. It's sometimes it's going to be really difficult, and Michael, I would be interested in us discussing this. I think there are certain environments where it doesn't work, and then you have another order of problem to deal with. I don't want to suggest a utopia here, right? But I do want to suggest that sometimes this is a commitment that might mean a decades-long process of re-education. In my previous posting as a minister at a Lutheran church, I always told my staff, "Hey, we're thinking 7 to 10 years here. We're not thinking 1 to 2. 7 to 10." Allison, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. So when I was, as I said, the group that I was working with was very, very hesitant and very fearful. And so as far as like kind of an order of steps in pedagogy, I think first is understanding your context and the DNA and what makes up that culture. And then remembering that you are a minister to your people. And that means that if this seems like a mountain to climb for them, that it's broken down into kind of these baby steps and small increments, and only really giving them as much change as they can handle. I think there's also an element of compromise. I was hoping that in this particular Bell group that we would be meeting every week with the local organization. But that ended up not being the right thing, both for the church and for the organization itself. I think it's also a lot of open and frank conversations and listening. So after that initial reaction that I was not anticipating, I took a second, or really a couple days, to just sit and kind of to listen underneath the comments and to hear, I'm scared of change. I'm scared that I'm not going to be able to do what you're asking me to do. This fear of loss, and being able to minister and have conversations about what that means and how we can move forward, as well as addressing concerns of actual individuals. So having one-on-one meetings, I had lots of one-on-one meetings with people just to hear their concerns, so that way they also felt heard and listened to and understood, and gave me an opportunity to also explain why it was important that we do this. And yeah, I think just all in all, remembering to minister to these people, and that it's the job of the leader to see, 50,000 miles in front of you, and know that the congregation may only be able to see like the first mile, and that tension of trying to explain that vision and also get them to that next step.
I think just riffing off of what you said, Allison, and Brian's comment and Michael's question and so on and so forth, we, especially in relation to Brian's comment, I think there's an expression that I like to use that is notions of normativity or aspirations to normativity. When we either have this either an emotional understanding or a somehow narrated established notion that the way we do it is the best way to do it. It's the orthodox, the classical, the traditional, the whatever term you want to use there, right? In other words, the right way to do it. And everyone else's way is okay, but it's not as okay as our, right? So these notions of normativity, sometimes they're aspirations of normativity, right? And then we go into the whole kind of like imperialist mindset where really we want you to dress like us and speak like us and act like us and, play by our rules. And again, extremely complicated, also something we're trying to avoid, actively avoid. That's part of the I think the covenant of radical hospitality, which means, and Allison's example from the Bell Group is great because it really speaks to how these are deeply ingrained in us. It's deeply ingrained, and so much work to not necessarily get rid of them, but move beyond them. Right? Courage is not when you're not scared. Courage is when you are scared, but you're still able to take that step and engage with that practice or with that culture, whatever it is, which then, in a sense, moves these notions of normativity to the side. And Brian, I think that really speaks to your comment, right? It kind of diffuses some of the threat, at least hopefully, of what you're trying to do. And then the other part, I think that's important in the process, is actively relinquishing power, which is something that is very difficult for us, especially for leadership. And I would say both clergy and lay leadership, because we're trained to think the other way. So right now, for example, in our comments, we're saying, we have to have this 50,000 mile view while the congregation might not see another mile. That may be true, but that doesn't mean it's not important that you relinquish control at some point. So if you bring someone in and people see you giving them the platform, giving them the microphone, letting them pilot the boat or whatever, then I think that is a way of modeling, of demonstrating what it means to engage in radical hospitality. Michael, you wrote vulnerability as a leader. Yes. So it's a performance of an ethical commitment. You're not only wanting your congregation to take, but you are wanting to take as well. Martha said, centering the marginalized. Yes. So you're actively giving away power. And that means that the program will not look like what you wanted it to look like. You're not going to go the same places that you thought you were going to go. And it's not going to be as pretty as you thought it was going to be, but it'll probably be meaningful in a very different kind of way. Brian, you want to jump in? I'm happy to do that, what you just suggested.
So during this conference, we're going to have a couple of sessions where we talk about next year, because next year is our 100-year anniversary. We're going to be hosting a joint international conference, because it's every 7 years we've done this joint international with a couple of our sister organizations in Europe, but we're hoping to expand that to include folks from all around the globe. And we're hosting the conference in DC, and it's our 100-year anniversary. So my mind, as you've been talking about this, and we've had a conversation about this already a few weeks ago. We've already invited, or like we've already done this thing where we're in this position of, hey, we're having this conference. We'll try to help you get here. Can you be here to present? And we've kind of done that privileged thing already that you talked about earlier in the session. But I wonder what other thoughts you have on next year as regards to our international conference and this idea of radical hospitality.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah. Well, this is a conversation that Mike and I have been having kind of back and forth, because it's difficult, right? It's really tricky, for example, to recognize and leverage the privilege that we do have to effect change, instead of not acknowledging it and trying to erase it. It's like, yes, we might have resources that you don't, and infrastructure that you don't, and processes in place that we don't, and we want to use them towards this particular purpose or in this particular direction. So I think that commitment is foundational. Number two is how that commitment gets expressed in the language and in the action items, right? So how you invite and how you commit at the beginning and say, okay, because we are in this position, then we are willing to, go through these steps with you and for you in order to advocate for your participation. That might be a second. And then the third might be, how do we go where you are? So, it might mean, for example, having satellite conferences in some of these places where people on the ground, provided translation, can interact with some of the conversations that we're having during the conference itself, or program after the conference that brings a couple of things back, or that perpetuate that active listening into a dialogue, right? So instead of thinking about it as, boom, we had this one event, thanks for coming, great, peace out. We're now inviting you to be a partner at a table, not for one meal, but to, partake in this narrative that kind of goes beyond that one meal. So I think there's a few initial things. They can be expressed many different ways. And then you start messing with issues like translation, travel, the logistics behind all that, the technology, the fact that in many places people don't have access to the technology, right? But now more than ever, we're in a position to engage with those processes because of COVID, because of the information revolution. I think this now is the time. Again, now is the time. So this is an active conversation. Any thoughts anyone has on that, I think, are really important. Allison, I want to give you an opportunity to wrap up, but before I do, I want to address Michelle. Is that it? Is that Brian? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Margaret Leask.
Margaret Leask. I'm sorry, Margaret. Your question about is Sunday morning a time of worship and of learning uncomfortable new modes of worship? That is, I don't know. You know, I think different churches solve it different ways, right? So you might have congregations that will outright say, we're in the service, we're going to learn this thing. And it works in some environments, it doesn't work in others. Other congregations tend to dilute that learning process or outsource it into Spotify playlists, online videos, choir rehearsals, things like that. I think both are fine. When I think of liturgical or the theology of worship, to use a broader term, I do think that the engagement with that awkwardness and that uncomfortableness during weekly worship is important. I do. And that's just my personal theological opinion. Because I think that when we all go through this together as a component of the liturgy, right, of the service, then I think we're doing something that is inherently part of what worship is. But that's just, again, you know, my opinion on that. And thanks to the, you know, that theologization and musicking framework, I think you can think of it in piecemeal fashion, right? So we do a little bit of it every week, a little bit more every week. There was a time, for example, at my congregation when I thought that preaching like a month-long series about hospitality and worship would do the trick, and it did nothing but provoke angry debate. And I realized that quickly that the best way to do it was to have, I needed one-liners. Every Sunday, I fashioned a one-liner that I would say sometime during worship or right before it or in a prayer. And I did that for 3 years. I never again preached about it. I mean, in those 3 years, I only did one-liners. And I spent sometimes hours coming up with these things and rehearsing them, but they really changed the way the congregation thought about that in the context of worship, right? So I think there are many different ways of dealing with that. Yes, yeast planted, very, very good. And then you just kind of, you have to nurse it through, right? Sourdough might be the, the technical, bitter dough in the case of some congregations. Thank you, Margaret. Ellison, would you wrap us up?
Sure. First, or once again, thank you for this time and being able to be a part of this discussion. And then I just kind of wanted to say that there is no right or wrong way or one way of kind of extending radical hospitality, especially with this intersection of music. And I'm incredibly excited to see how all of this kind of unfolds and to learn alongside everybody else.
Thank you, Allison. I want to make myself available if you have further questions, or I'm at marcell@smu.edu, and you can reach me here. You can reach me through the Hymn Society stuff that's also available. And I want to thank the staff of the Hymn Society and what you're doing this year. It's tricky, it's great, it's important. Keep at it. And thank you for coming, all of you.